One of the biggest things I say when you're showing up as a company, putting a brown face to a white narrative, we know that it's a brown face to a white narrative.
Hello and welcome back to the Culture and Legacy podcast, where we are talking about life behind the scenes as entrepreneurs and just really getting into the reality of what life looks like outside of just what we see on social media or just what media portrays entrepreneurship as. We want to get behind the scenes of our lives and really connect there. My name is Matthew Reed, and I'm the host of this podcast. And today I am excited to have my friend LaToya Collins-Jones on here with me today. LaToya, what's going on?
Man, quarantining.
I hear that. It's been like, I think we're going on like 40 months, 4 months or something. This is.
Yeah, I just, I feel like, today technically, it feels like every day is the 150th day of the month.
Yeah.
Like you just,
for real.
You just stop counting at this point. I just be like, today's a work day. Good, cool.
Yeah, like we're over halfway into 2020, and it feels like it's been 3 years already.
It's we're dog earing it for sure.
Yeah, really. I had a friend tell me that everybody was wrong in 2015 when we answered the question, "What's your 5-year plan?" That's not happening.
No, yeah, nothing. None of those things are happening for sure.
So, LaToya, for people who don't know you or what you're about, why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, what you've been up to recently?
Yeah. So LaToya Collins-Jones, and I'm actually a diversity and equity and inclusion SME, if you will, subject matter expert. Right now, I work in the marketplace for a Fortune 50 tech company in that space. Aside from that, I have an amazing husband, Michael, a daughter, Lauren, and then I have a little one on the way. He should be arriving here this month, actually. So we're like,
wow.
We're D-Daying it up. So ready to welcome him in that edition. And then I have a juvenile delinquent dog named King. Outside of that, I think I'd say like I'm a creative, but, really, a lot of it is, spending time when and where I can, as you can imagine, in diversity inclusion space. It can be taxing and emotional work, and it takes a lot of that. And so, for me, it's been a bit of a break, kind of from the creative side, but really looking forward to this break that's coming up to kind of reinvigorate some of that. And so that's kind of a little bit of what I do, but yeah. And I think the other thing I say is I'm very much a culture connoisseur. Right? Like I love reading and studying and consuming different parts of all types of cultures.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really shapes a lot of who I am, but I think that's just me being a military brat, which is where a lot of my fascination from that comes.
Okay. So let's dig into that a little bit. So this is the Culture and Legacy podcast. So what does culture mean to you? How does that drive, the things that you do? You kind of share, you threw that word out there as part of your background and growing up as a military brat. So like, what does that mean? And
in my sense, I think, when we talk about culture, I think there's so many facets of it, right? Like
mm-hmm.
you have, the culture of your family, you have the culture of, where you live, you have, your race or ethnicity, the culture of that. And I just to become more fascinated by it. And I think social media only grew that fascination because it just opened your world up to so many things and so many ideas and different ways of living. And so I guess part of that passion for it is just like, I genuinely love people. Like for the most part, like I say for the most part, like everybody has their flaws, but like I'm that
Some
person.
People I don't like. That's okay.
It takes a lot for me to be like, nah, like I genuinely have like a genuine love and interest of people. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of culture drives that, right? Like how people think and who they are. And, I think a lot of that shapes, so much of so much of what we see of a person, but also it helps shape the things that we don't see. And so if you can understand somebody's culture, I feel like there are some things that you may be struggling with. It's, if you understand their culture, there may be things that you may still not understand or agree with, but you're more empathetic to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that has a lot to do even with my job, right? In diversity and inclusion, understanding different cultures. We work with, I work across all different cultures and supporting that in my company. And so, we're with my company that I work for. And so with that, I have to start to really understand and appreciate culture so that I can elevate them, right? Because I have to show up and elevate their voice or elevate their cause in a way that's true to their culture, whether that's LGBTQ, Asian community, Black community, Latinx, Hispanic community, family communities. Like it's all of that matters. And if I don't have an understanding of their culture and what's important to them, then I'm missing the mark because I don't necessarily understand it all.
So how do you study culture? Because I mean, it is kind of a broad, thing, but how do you, to be able to, because you made it sound like, you are an ambassador for every piece of these cultures, within the workplace, whether it is the LGBT community, whether it's Black community, Hispanic community, religious communities, whatever it is, you are an ambassador for these people in the workplace. How do you even begin to even study that?
Listen. That's literally like the first thing. Just listen. Like that, like if people listened, that would probably cover, I really think there's about 60% of the way. Part of my job is just listening. It's not anecdotally, I'm a strategist. Part of my job is a strategist. And so my strategy has to be informed by quantitative data as well as qualitative data. But the qualitative data is really me listening. Quantitative kind of drives, what I do and like the goals and objectives I have to have and need as just a business from a business perspective. Or even when I'm talking to people who want diversity and inclusion outside of that, right? Like there's still some quantitative, like actual numerical data that you have to look at to get from point A to point B, right? But then there's qualitative data, and how I go about getting from point A to point B really has to be listening to those communities. I read quite a bit. I watch a lot of documentaries. I consume content from other places, right? So, probably one of my favorite things about quarantine is I've started to discover other series like on Netflix that are outside of the United States, right?
Yeah.
And so it's been like one of my favorite things to do. It's funny because sometimes I may even start watching and I'll be like, their lips don't match their their words. But over time, you start to even just, it starts to shape just different parts of your understanding of what things look like and how people live, just even by just by consuming some of their entertainment. I think it kind of goes from there.
That's interesting, and that's something I didn't really even think about because media, I guess we could say media kind of drives culture, or how we interpret it or how we view it or represent us. And so if we consume the media of other cultures, then we're at least able to get a glimpse of what that's like.
Yeah. At least, and sometimes it's majority culture. Same here, right? Yeah. I think some people have perceptions about what and who America is, which isn't always indicative of media. But I try to, like stay true to at least understanding, at least pieces of it, or trying to find more holistic approach. But at the end of the day, I really do think part of understanding culture is just listening, reading, understanding, hearing people tell their stories from their perspectives, with their voice, I think is key.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I want to ask a potentially deep question. So
all right.
So
thanks for the heads up.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, if I am, quote unquote, uneducated about other cultures, I need to listen to them because they know their culture best.
Yes.
Or they're experiencing the culture and the hardships that come along with that.
Yes.
And so one of the things that's, we're kind of in this Black Lives Matter momentum right now. And I find myself online, or I used to, I blocked those people, but I found myself like the people or the conversations that frustrated me the most are the ones that just didn't get it.
Yeah.
And whether it's because they just didn't understand or they just didn't believe that, and not even just Black lives, but any lives, any culture, like their experience does not matter. And whether they say that out front or whether they say that outright, or just, you know, by their actions or inaction says
Mm-hmm.
that, those are the ones that kind of frustrated me. And
Yeah.
so my question is, you know, especially for you working in a diversity, equity, and inclusion space, and this may not be you, but if I have a company or a business where I'm an entrepreneur and, you know, I don't want to sound like a jerk, but let's say somebody's morals or
Mm-hmm.
ethics doesn't align with the beliefs of another culture, right?
Yep.
Let's say, you know, right now, we're, you know, let's say it's the like LGBTQ community,
Mm-hmm.
or Black lives, or even immigrants. You
Yep.
know, I'm not saying me, but, you know, somebody may not stand with those cultures. How
Mm-hmm.
can you still be a person, a company, an entrepreneur that can still be, I guess, inclusive, though you may not agree? Or how can you even begin to change your mind towards these cultures?
Yeah, so that was definitely a loaded question. So I'm going to split it.
Okay.
I'm going to kind of split it in two because I think it was almost two questions in one. So number one, as an entrepreneur, business owner, you have to establish what your baseline is on what and who you're willing to do business with, right?
Okay.
That's what sets your values. And I think we're seeing a lot of that with companies having to draw a line in the sand. Just for the sake of like company brand and values, right? So if we say these are our brand, this is our brand, this is our values, this is who we are, this is our mission and our vision, we're not going to do business with people who don't do this,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think it's very clear. You have to establish what your values, your mission, your vision, and your goals are, and who you're willing to do business with and who you're not. As an entrepreneur, that's your responsibility. Especially if you're an entrepreneur who has employees, it's important that they know, right? You know, there are companies who say we will not do business with people who hold racist values or have said, like, it's just a line in the sand. We have no problem walking away in that business. So as an entrepreneur from that perspective, I think it's absolutely important and imperative that you establish that baseline out of the gate. If you haven't, really kind of wrestle with it, really think through it. I think Black Lives Matter specifically is tough because it's extremely nuanced, right? Black Lives Matter, there's the organization, there's the movement, and then there's just the statement.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times, what you're seeing, at least right now, is people are trying to jam them all together. And
Yep.
it's very problematic. And so some people can't see beyond the organization to actually hear the movement, to hear or see the movement, or just the statement in
Or
itself,
just the people being affected by it.
or be the people being affected by it, right? And so Black Lives Matter is one that's it's just so nuanced. And part of that, you know, I know you said, hey, you're not gonna, people eventually will see who they're going to see, and if they're willing to listen, they're willing to listen. And so kind of the other side of that coin of your question, Matt, is, you know, what do you do? How do you, you know, if I'm trying to figure this out, like, it goes back to listening, but at the same time, it's still a line in the sand. At some point, people, you know, they're saying, like, when people show you who they are, believe them. I
Yeah.
think, you know, sometimes, you know, I can show people online that I can completely disagree with you and still be respectful.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing now in culture is that if people are either being willing to listen and start to understand and not just pull all of our information from media, and really starting to get to know each other. And then the other piece of that are people who are willing to dig their heels in. And people who are willing to dig their heels in goes back to, what are my values? What are my stakes? You know, as an entrepreneur, who and how and what am I willing to do business with? Um, and then from there, you make your decision. That's really kind of how I see it. You know, you have to kind of start to figure that out. And for some people, there isn't a middle ground.
Yeah.
And that some people, it'd be great if we said, hey, you know, we can agree to disagree. Unfortunately, in the climate that we're in, they're so polarizing. I would say, like, it's pretty much you're kind of for or against, and not a lot of people are willing to meet in the middle. And so because of that, I think we're seeing it. It's kind of becoming a yes or a no.
Yeah. And so I feel like just, thinking of news in the last few years, like, so I think of, let's say, two different types of companies.
Yep.
One, you have that bakery that says we are not going to serve, the LGBTQ community,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you have, more recently where people are like yesterday or this morning, people are realizing that Black Lives Matter. And then by the afternoon, people are calling out companies by not making statements
Yep.
siding with Black Lives Matter. And
Yep.
so also on both of those, it's kind of like, man, this bakery, they have said this is where we stand. These are the kind of people that we want to
Mm.
serve. And yet they get backlash.
Yep.
And then on the other hand, you have these companies that are just like, we haven't even had time to meet yet to make sure that we're all on the same page. And
Yep.
people are willing to boycott us until we make a statement that
Yep.
ultimately may not even be what aligns with our company, but we just need to please the court of public opinion, How do you, this is also maybe two questions by two situations, but how do we balance that space?
Yeah. So, two different spaces for sure, right? So if we'll dissect it between kind of, I'll say, like the small business owner and then the larger corporations. Small business owners, at the end of the reality is all businesses have the right to deny doing business with people. I think, yeah, will that small bakery get raked over the coals? Absolutely. And part of it is, one of the biggest words I've heard thrown out in these recent weeks is discrimination, right? And it's funny because, like, I hear people say, I'm going to bring up a hot topic, Matt. I'm just letting you know I'm about to drop it in here.
Let's talk about it.
But like, people will say I'm being discriminated against because I don't want to wear a mask, and so I can't shop in a store. I'm being discriminated against. And the reality is discrimination, as it qualifies, it basically it's identity, not choice. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so even when you talk about like LGBTQ, that's one that's so nuanced because there's even differences about whether that's a choice versus identity, right? So even that particular community, as you start to kind of move through the nuances and layers of that. And so discrimination is really based on race, religion, sex, and it actually does cover sexual orientation. And so, yeah, they're going to get backlash. And I think at that point, that bakery has to basically say, this is who we are, this is what it is, and be willing to take the backlash. The reality is those communities are strong. They're very vocal. And if you are not, I find it's a lot easier for companies to take stances like that when your world is very insular. So if you have what we call like cisgender, which is cisgender is how you were born, like you identify with the sex that you were born. So if most of your world is cisgender, heterosexual, Christian, or like I would say just your basic, typical life, I think it's easier for you to say, hey, we're not going to do business with this group of people and exclude a group of people.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I think if your world expands, I think you start to be more willing to people where it impacts you and it's people that you care about, then I think it does start to shift and change how you do business, right? Where you're saying, I always boil things down to a humanity. It's a humanity issue for me, which goes to, now we're going to flip to corporate. And, there's a lot of nuances that happen in corporate, right? How and what they say, there's legal ramifications. There are big dollars at play. There are customers at play. There's a lot of things that are happening. Decisions are happening. The larger the organization, you can imagine probably the larger amount of opinions and varying opinions that you may have. My thing is it's humanity. I think, there are certain things that just aren't negotiable. Racism should never be negotiable,
Mm-hmm.
right? True discrimination should never be negotiable. And so part of the thing when we look at big corporations is they have Black people working in those corporations. And so I think silence in those moments doesn't show credence to who's actually pouring into your business and building up your business, right? And that's where I think a lot of it comes into play. Not so much, I think, in the small business space, depending on how big that, how big that small business is. But when you look at corporations, a lot of corporations now have, diversity and inclusion initiatives or teams, or, some type of arm where they're saying we're an inclusive environment. And for you to remain silent on something that plagues a community that works for you, it's going to be problematic.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I see it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So it's pretty much, you're going to be exposed, and for a lot of companies, it's bad timing. I don't say bad timing, but it was more so it was inevitable.
Yeah.
Like we could even say, like, let's take big companies like H&M, like Dove, like Prada, and people who don't know, H&M got some backlash because they put out there was a t-shirt of a little black boy in a shirt or
Yep.
sweater, whatever, that was like coolest monkey in the yard or whatever.
Yep. I remember
Dove, they had a commercial. I feel like this was I don't think this was a Super Bowl commercial, but they had a commercial where they had it was like a black girl in this brown shirt, and she took off her shirt, and then she was like a white girl in a white shirt underneath.
Yeah.
It's like, what are you saying here, Dove? And then Prada got it. They had displays of these blackface
Yep.
monkey products that we won't even go into that. But so we have big companies, like this, that are you see this, and a lot of people in a room made the decision that these things are okay to promote our companies, our billion-dollar companies. People said they're okay.
Yeah.
And then it's people like us that are like, really, y'all didn't think this through? Y'all didn't think this through very well, And it's like, why would you do something like that? Like, do you not see? Do you not get it?
Yeah.
So how are companies not getting it? Like, is
they're not in the room? Yeah, absolutely. They're not. Nobody's in the room, right? Like, who was in the room?
Yeah.
That's a constant question, right? So, who was in the room? Sometimes, when mistakes are made, they've outsourced to an agency. And then the question becomes, even in the agency world, right? So you look at the PR agency world and Matt, let's be honest, we can look at the creative space. Like, you and I talk all the time about our favorite creators. Most of our favorite creators don't look like us. They're white guys, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just being honest, right? So I think if you look at the creative space, you look at the agency space, it's heavily underrepresented, right? And so with that, we could say, how could that happen? But I also wouldn't be surprised, right? If we're not in the room, when certain things happen, it's you can tell, right? And I'll take race out of it. We'll take race out of it. And, you and I talk about products and all of this stuff all the time, right? And we'll be like, that was so stupid. Why did they do that thing, right? Yeah. Most people don't do that thing, right? And so what happened is they went from product development all the way to product launch without actually having some level of input from your end user or from people. And so, people get raked over the coal for a product to be like, that was weird. The placement of that made no sense in a very practical sense, because it's the same thing. People are creating in silos and boxes. And you're not understanding the full experience. And I think that happens, a lot in the marketing world. One of my biggest qualms about it is, one of the biggest things I say, when you're showing up as a company, putting a brown face to a white narrative, we know that it's a brown face to a white narrative.
Yeah.
Right. Or we know, one of my other favorite examples is, McDonald's commercial on ABC, is very different than, the McDonald's commercial on BET. You got Mary J. Blige singing. Mary J. Blige done did a whole song. And so then, you're being pandered to, right? So there has to be a level of how can companies show up, or how can companies create in a way that's authentic to their market, and allow those communities to maintain their voice. And and that's where it has to become very intentional, right? And that's what I basically call it intentional inclusion, right? Where you maintain the brand of who you are and the essence of who you are. But if you're going after and talking to certain markets and people and different things like that, you know, how can I maintain my voice as a Black woman, still show up well for the company? Or how can I express the values and the missions of the company, where it's still very nuanced to me, as a Black woman, where I'm not being fed this white narrative, right? Because you can see it, right? Like I'm pretty sure you've seen a video or a commercial or something, you're like, that's weird. Because like, you know, there's an assumption that because a brown face is there, they'll be like, oh, I need to get that because it's a brown face, right? It didn't hit because it wasn't your narrative. It's just somebody who looked like you. Right?
So just by having, you know, if I put out a commercial, just by having somebody that looks like me is not really enough if it's not connecting with me on that deeper cultural level.
Right. Like, have you ever seen, like, sometimes it's the silliest things. It may be like a household product or a cereal commercial. We'd be like, we don't do that. Have you ever said that?
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So it's interesting. I laugh at it. It's funny. I think it's slightly anecdotal. But it's very true. Like there have been times where I've watched this commercial. I'll be like, that don't happen. We don't do that. We don't picnic like that. That is not our picnic table. The potato salad is white. Why is the potato salad white? Our potato salad is yellow.
Why is there raisins in it?
Yeah. So it becomes this thing where it's like, and so that's where I feel like companies, you know, really kind of miss the mark and mess it up, I guess, if you will. But you got to have people in those spaces.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's more than just having people in the spaces, but it's having people in the spaces that are in leadership, that have decision making roles.
Absolutely.
Like, because, you know, you can, I don't know, let's say big company X, you know, they can hire me and say, oh, you know, we have a person of color on our staff, like, you know, he's if something were wrong, like, you know, he'd say something, but like, you know, I know nothing about, you know, marketing and advertising to, you know, to say like, yeah, that's going to work. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I'm still not that qualified person.
Yep.
But there are qualified people out there.
Yep.
And I think, you know, people kind of, you know, mess this up. Like you know, let's say even like colleges where it's like, oh, you know, we need to meet a quota. Like we need to have,
I hate that word. Yeah.
I know. Like, you know, we need to have, you know, for every 10 people, we got to have, you know, a military person, and we got to have an LGBT person. We need to have a person of color and a Hispanic person. And so then we have companies that, you know, they look the part, but they're not putting out anything relevant, you know?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, talk about that. Like, you know,
it's really tough. So there's a couple things. I think one of the things that people have to understand, and this is just diversity and inclusion as a whole, it's not a box check. Okay. So what I mean by that, so if we look at what's intentional, part of the conversation is, you know, which only happens particularly when we talk about Black, indigenous or people of color, right? Which is, you're only there because you are the box checker, right? Not because I'm qualified. Nobody else, very few times, I would add women in there with an asterisk, in addition to that, but you're only here because you're a woman. You're only here because we need a diversity hire, not because I'm qualified, not because I'm deserved to be here. And so, which is why I hate the word quota, right? You have goals, right? So if you say, hey, I want my company to be more inclusive, you have to be heavily intentional about it. And so there's not, I think some people, it's why I hate the word quota, right? You can have a goal in mind, but how do you reach that? That means that, you know, maybe on the front end of your hiring process, you do set a goal or a quota to say, hey, we want 10 people. Of these 10, we need at least this many women and this many people of color. Right? Doesn't necessarily mean they get the job, but you've got to start in the pipeline somewhere. These people aren't going to naturally manifest. Sometimes the conversation is, are you going where they are? It's a conversation I have all the time. Well, I can't find the Black talent. We're like, are you looking for the Black talent? Right? Like, are you going to predominantly white schools? Are you going to UT? Are you going to, Yeah. Oh, are you going to places where you're going to find the talent, even as an entrepreneur, right? If you're going, let's just say when outside opens back up, are you attending conferences that are predominantly white? Are you attending or looking for spaces and creatives? Like if you need a video editor, each one of these communities have pockets, right? And are you going to those spaces to look for them? Are you trying to find them in your space? And if you're trying to find them in your space and your space isn't diverse, you're always going to run into an issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's part of the conversation. Go where they are. If you're really passionate about it, get out of your comfort zone and go where they are. Right. And then find the talent within there. Actually, there on Twitter yesterday, there's this kid who was basically making NBA 2K covers like that were amazing. Like, and he's like a teenager, right? And I was like, yo, this is crazy. And I'm thinking in my head, like, man, if I had a company, I'd scoop him up. But that's where he is. That's the medium of where he is. I don't need a graphic designer with a graphic designer degree. I would get that kid, right? And groom him, in my organization that way, right? And so I think it's a lot of that's why I hate the word quota, but I think you have to be intentional. And sometimes, when I talk about intentional inclusion, if we look at diversity, everybody's diverse. Everybody. That's why there's no such thing as a diverse hire. We're all diverse. Like, let's squash that term. Like, okay. So you have that. Everybody's diverse in some shape, form, or fashion. There's intersectionalities that make you who you are. Everybody is diverse. Then you have kind of equity, which are the systems and things that are in play. And then you have inclusion, right? Which is not only are you here, we're different. You have your systems and your processes to make things more equitable in your company. And then you have inclusion, which is basically meaning, hey, they've got a voice at the table and they're being included in those processes. When I think about intentional inclusion, I think about it in terms of how intentional, actually, I'll give you the actual definition I came up with intentional inclusion, because I want to be very specific. But it's basically creating a systematic and deliberate approach for inclusion that leverages diversity and equity as a measurement of success in your structures, your programs, your initiatives, your marketing, and everything else, right? So you're leveraging somebody's diversity. You're using equity, which is really about how am I doing business? Who am I doing business with? What does that process look like? And am I doing it in an equitable fashion? And then looking at it as, inclusion then can be measured, if you will, right? Because you're being intentional in every single step of the way, right? And I think that's, and I'll spin it with entrepreneurs real quick, because I want to make sure you get your, when I think about it, even for entrepreneurs, when we look at pricing, right, you have to know that at certain points, you're going to price yourself potentially out of markets, and that's okay. But you also have to know that, right? So if you say, hey, I want 50%, Black people or people of color in my customer pool, and then 50% not, but you're priced high and your market is entrepreneurs, just know that just like statistically, the data will show you that African-American business owners, or, particularly sometimes people of color business owners, are not grossing that. They don't have the amount of income, the startup income. They don't have the equity. Sometimes they're more likely to fail. So you have to account for that. So either I've got to overmarket to that market to get to my 50%, or I have to reset my expectations. And so it's just kind of it. You have to really be intentional in understanding it. And that's where people, I feel like, kind of trip up, if you will.
Yeah. So let's, kind of at the end of this. Thinking of so we've talked a lot about, bigger companies, what that looks like in that space. But what about like the solopreneurs, or even like the people that, you have a staff of 2 others, and, I feel like I won't say most, but a lot of entrepreneurs, it's them and their spouse,
Yeah.
And so you may not have the luxury or the ability to hire on a person of color, or anybody that's, identifies in this, diverse space, or some way, just to make that, to make the appearances. how can you as a solopreneur, just you and your spouse or a team of 3, or even practically, what are some things that you can do for your business to show that you are inclusive and that
Yeah.
you're open to, different cultures, and that you're not discriminative or, whatever. Just let's
Yeah.
talk to that person.
Yeah. So as a former solopreneur, I definitely, which is also why I'm back in corporate. I hated being a solopreneur. I'm not wired that way, Matt. There's a couple things. One, I think about, look at the spaces that you network in, right? I think that's one very practical way to do that, right? Like your networking experience. Like I see you out with other creatives. I get jealous sometimes, but it's totally cool.
Of me?
Yeah, I'd be like, oh, he's out being all creative and stuff with other people. It's just like our brother-sister relationship. I'd be like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
But like, I think I look at like how, even you and your wife are very inclusive, right? I can see that. I can see that from how and who you do business with, right? So you give a very holistic view of your world as an entrepreneur. You kind of let us behind the curtain. So I can even, if I just followed both of you on social, I get and understand that your world is inclusive because you guys have kind of opened that up. Does that make sense? So I
Yeah,
think
absolutely.
so I know that just based on just, you sharing your behind the scenes, that you create and you collaborate with all types of people. And that in and of itself, I think is like super cool. So one, look at your network, who you're networking with. I think, showing behind the scenes, and really kind of peeking behind the curtain helps for solopreneurs. If it's 1 or 2 or 3 of you all, I even think, if you're passionate about a topic that's inclusive, like speak up, right? And it goes back to, do you know your values, your mission, your vision? Because you may detract some people, but I also don't believe you should do business with everybody.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody's not your customer. And so if you lose customers who get upset because you're speaking out on something, then
they're not really your customer.
They were never really your customer, right?
Yeah.
And you have to be okay with that. And so I think that there are ways that you can do that. Find different ways to storytell. If you're a solopreneur, you have customers and clients. Make sure that you're showing up and you're sharing those voices. On your website, do you have tutorials like, where you're going in and you're sharing, not tutorials, testimonials, that, your testimonials are across the board, that those are diverse, that you're sharing their experiences as well, because people need to see a mirror, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I can't gauge like how well you'll get my vision if I don't see that you've possibly done work, with somebody who may look like me, or may have this, I won't even say look like me, has similar situations, right? Or similar experiences. So I think that's how you do that as a solopreneur or somebody who's a little bit smaller, and just get active, like I said, in your communities. I think that's such a big piece of it.
Yeah, and I think the big part of that is that diversity, equity, and inclusion, or your term intentional diversity, intentional inclusive,
intentional inclusion,
intentional inclusion. It's not just the way you look, like it's the way that you run your company.
Yep.
I'm not, but I could have, me as a Black man, I can have a majority white staff or a majority, Native American staff or a majority LGBTQ staff or whatever, and still not be diverse or inclusive. If I don't, hear them, if I don't listen, one of the first pieces of advice that you gave, and then showing that our beliefs, our values, our mission is actually representative of the people I have or of my beliefs. And I think that's something that is being missed. We think so much into appearances. If I have a Black person on staff, oh yeah, we're diverse. We got Charles,
Poor
he's
Charles.
Charles. He's on our team,
Yeah.
But it's more than that, Are you listening to Charles? Does he have an opportunity to speak? Like
well, and Charles doesn't speak for the whole Black race, right?
That's very true.
And so like you're even seeing one thing too is it's funny because you said people of color and I forgot about this. It's very funny because now you're starting to see this new acronym pop up. It's basically BIPOC instead of just so Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I think I actually am a fan of that because I think it helps denote the differences between the two. A Black experience in America is very different than some people of color's experience, depending on where you roll in the space, right? So, and even Indigenous, right? So it all, like each one of those communities are very, very different. And I think, you know, Charles can speak to the Black experience, and that's it. But he can't even necessarily speak to the whole Black experience. Where did Charles? Yeah, just his Black experience, right? Like Charles may have grown up in an affluent neighborhood that was, you know, for the most part, you know, quite accepting of him. And there still are nuances. And I was actually on a panel yesterday where, you know, there was this, we were talking about equity and equity and inclusion and, you know, what that looked like in the education space. And I said, you know, what's funny is I was like, my daughter, because of, you know, my socioeconomic status, my dad being in the military, you know, my experiences as an entrepreneur, my daughter actually was not on this ladder rung that started in the hole. She actually fits the profile of what this depiction was as mainly white students, right? Like, you know, great income, has, if Lauren needed a tutor, you know, I could afford a tutor, you know, we're middle to upper class, you know, middle or upper class, you know, like she has a lot of access, right? But the funny thing is the ladder for her is still broken because she's Black and she's a girl. Yeah. And so I was like, it's like, yeah, even this is flawed, but like, that's where it all becomes nuanced. And the other thing too is, you can look this up, you can Google it. Companies that are more diverse are more profitable, period.
Okay.
That's it. They innovate better and they're more profitable. That's a fact. So it's important that you figure it out. Even like all Black agencies, I think, you know, all Black companies are great. Nobody complains about all white companies. I think it's great, but I think sometimes you can potentially, depending on who your market is, you can miss the mark. And so you have to kind of think about, you know, you think about it both ways. You know, like how and what does that, you know, look like, and kind of what those experiences play into.
Yeah. That's good, LaToya.
I could talk about this stuff all day, man.
I know, I bet. So I want to ask you one final question, and this isn't anything, this isn't anything that we've really talked about, but this is a question that I ask everybody that comes onto the podcast.
Okay.
So my final question for you, LaToya, is what is the legacy that you want to leave?
Oh man, I'm so glad. You know what? I probably would have freaked out if you would have asked me this question 2 weeks ago. Luckily, I had a branding session.
Okay.
So recently. So I actually could answer this, I feel like very wholeheartedly. And the legacy that I want to leave, I think for me, is that you know, at the end of the day, I want people to have been able to show up better and more fully themselves because of their proximity to me. I think so much of society, people are waiting for permission to be their fullest selves, their whole selves. And when we do that, when we curtail who we are and we cover ourselves, when we're not living authentically, I think that we're missing out on so much of society, right? And ultimately, you know, the legacy I want to live is that, or leave, I guess, live and leave, honestly, is that you can show up, you can be fully who you are, the best parts of yourself, continue to learn and grow as a person and honor other people where they are and who they are. And I think that ultimately that's how we move forward as a community, how we move forward in the world together, where we learn to appreciate each other's differences and we celebrate those and we see them. And then we learn to do those same things within us and not allow society to dictate or allow us to hate that part of us. Right. And that is ultimately kind of, you know, the legacy that I want to leave and live. And then probably the other one is just like laugh a lot. You know, like that's the other thing. I love seeing people laugh, hearing people laugh, making people laugh. I think, Matt, you get a lot of that goofiness from me. I can be a little bit out there, but you know, even for me, like it was struggling for me sometimes to even accept that part of me, right? Like sometimes I would only show that to certain people, but it's very much a part of who I am. I love making people laugh. And I think that is, that's where hope is. That's where humanity is, you know, and that's kind of where I would love to see, my mark on the world.
Yeah, that's very cool. I love that. So for people who, LaToya, who want to connect with you or, you know, see a little bit more of what you're up to, or even ask some more questions about this topic, how can people find you?
Yeah, I'm going to give the millennial answer, which is Google me. Yeah, I feel so weird. It's like, you know, it's like slight, I feel like it's slight arrogance, and then like, oh, just Google me, you'll find me.
Yeah. Do you have a business card? Oh yeah, Google.
Yeah, like a business card. What's that? Yeah, so there will be no more business cards due to social distancing, for the record. So actually, all jokes aside, Matt and I were joking about this before. I'm in the process of changing a lot of my monikers and stuff online. So pending when you guys see this, but like I'm on YouTube, you can just put LaToya Collins-Jones on YouTube. Also, you can connect with me that same way on LinkedIn. Right now, as of this date, my IG and my Twitter are Pretty Geeky Gal. But I probably will be changing both of those monikers. But once again, none of my stuff is locked down. So if you just Google my name or put my name in on any of those platforms, you can find me.
Yeah, cool.
Word.
Very cool. Well, Toya, thank you very much for joining me on this. I think, you know, in light of all, even outside of all these things that are going on right now,
Yeah.
I think this is such an important conversation that we need to have. Whether you are a solopreneur, whether you know you have a company of a few dozen, or you're a Fortune 500, you need to have this conversation. What is our core mission and values and purpose?
Yep.
And put it out there. Are you?
Yep.
You know, I can say like, oh yeah, I love all people, but then you know you're not really showing it, or people can't see that. You know. So, anyways, so people who are listening, thank you very much for listening and watching the Culture and Legacy podcast. Let's continue this conversation offline. Connect with us. We're on YouTube. We're on Instagram. We're on all podcast platforms. Check us out. Check out LaToya, and let's be better than we were yesterday.